appreciate your time today to talk about foreign influence with Mike and I. Just as a reminder, if you haven't attended our webinar in the past, we utilize the the chat function on Zoom for any Q&A. So feel free to type in your questions on the chat function, and we will leave time at the end to address those. So let me introduce myself. I am Ann Pfeiffer. I'm a senior director at Huron. I work within our higher education practice and specifically lead our research compliance services as it relates to grants management. And I have spent about 20 years now working with universities and academic medical centers on research compliance matters and broader institutional compliance matters as well, but primarily have been focused on helping universities or academic medical centers when going through inquiries or investigations from federal agencies, as well as doing proactive work for universities and their compliance functions and sponsored research. I am joined today by Mike Bernick. So Mike, you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Ann. I'm Mike Bernick. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells in Washington, D.C., where I lead our education industry sector practice. And my practice is also largely focused on research compliance with a particular emphasis on enforcement and oversight activity. So everything from false claims to IG investigations to voluntary disclosures, and probably for the past at least 18 months or so, a very substantial portion of my time has been spent on foreign influence issues. So, Ann, you want to carry on?
Yeah, so what we're going to cover today is to really kick off this year in 2021 talking about where we're at with federal enforcement around foreign influence and what we anticipate going forward, and then share some of Mike and I's experience working in this area, as he said, the last 18 months or so, and what we're learning and what we might recommend to you all as solutions for this particular area. So we'll provide a quick overview of the regulations and enforcement activity, and then discuss recent events and where federal sponsors may be heading. Mike and I will discuss our various perspectives on what we anticipate in this year and coming years, and then talk specifically about foreign influence inquiries that Mike and I have supported clients through, from the notification that you're receiving an inquiry or investigation all the way through resolution. And then I'll spend some time talking about ways that you might assess your risk factors and collect information to monitor risk going forward. So let's talk a little bit about where we're at and how we got to this point with enforcement around foreign influence. As you all are likely aware, in the last 2 to 3 years, NIH has really been looking into foreign ties as it relates to research. And what that means is they've been primarily focused on 2 areas or 2 intents. One is making sure that institutions or grantee institutions are disclosing foreign ties and resources to support research. So anything that's supporting your researchers' overall programs and portfolios for research, what those ties are with foreign entities, and making sure that those are disclosed. So NIH has spent the better half of 2 or 3 years now really reinforcing or reiterating the existing guidance around disclosures. And that's really to make sure that there's an understanding of your all of the commitments and resources available for research programs, as well as the integrity of the science and concern about infiltration from foreign entities on our American research. And so really it's the intent has been kind of twofold, but it has been accelerated in recent years by activity and some of the data security challenges we've seen with foreign entities. So we're going to talk about some of these particular areas listed here that NIH has been interested in, their intent behind their reviews, and how you can better manage this type of information across your institution. As a recap of what NIH has done to date, we have seen a lot of activity, only 6 criminal complaints that have been actually filed by Department of Justice, but we'll share with you some of those high-profile cases in a few moments, but certainly many more cases that were then referred to HHS OIG, so not necessarily to the Department of Justice, but were inquiries, I think about 30 to 40, if I have that right, that were referred on to OIG at some point for further review. The latest data is that they have reviewed or vetted well over 400 cases and researchers of potential concern. One of the ways they've identified potential concerns is, in fact, checking publications and acknowledgement sections and collaborators that's information that's publicly available on PubMed and other publications, and what you put in, compare it against your progress reports and technical reports and your other support documentation, and looking for disclosure gaps. So really, they're essentially started that, but have gone much further. And many of you may have been contacted either for an inquiry or investigation, as over 87 research institutions have been contacted. But we also know that HHS OIG sent out a questionnaire to grantees in the last few months, asking specific questions, gathering data. So not formal inquiries of your institution, but gathering information to you in a survey format to inform their efforts. And then NSF investigations are also ongoing. So this is not just an NIH inquiry that we're looking at. NSF OIG has recommended sanctions on about 20 cases, but also have referred a number of other criminal cases onto their OIG or DOJ that they haven't disclosed necessarily the total numbers. And the main themes, I think, from the NSF have been that really the challenges of investigators not disclosing information internally for institutions to then disclose in the formal grants procedures, and researchers that have been doing research in foreign locations without disclosing that. Mike, I'll turn it to you to talk about even more recent events as of last week, and then some of the enforcement activity, if you will.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So I think we're going to shift gears a bit and talk about the investigative process. And, just to tee us up, I mean, what Anne laid out, some of the broad strokes, NIH and NSF. And I think of the two, in my experience, NSF has been quite a bit more reasonable in their approach to these. I think we've made a number of disclosures to NSF that I'm quite confident that if made to NIH would have resulted in more oversight activity, and NSF has taken a pass on a number of them. It doesn't mean they're not, as Anne said, actively investigating them. They certainly are, but I think of the two, HHS has been, and NIH in particular, has been quite aggressive. In terms of other agencies that I think have been active in this space, the Defense Department has been very interested in activities outside the US of researchers. They've perhaps focused in some cases more on intellectual property issues. NASA has always been quite sensitive to global engagement, and particularly engagement in China. So I think it's important to just keep in mind that this is an issue for all of the major government sponsors: NIH, NSF, DoD, Department of Energy, NASA, all of them. And I think it's an issue that is continuing. It certainly has not let up. And last week we had the most recent high-profile matter, which was a faculty member who was arrested from MIT. And the fact pattern here is in some ways not remarkable for some of these cases in terms of receiving a fair amount of federal funding from a variety of different sources, having a fair bit of activity in China, including participation in talent programs, funding from sponsors in China. And you can see here that the potential sanctions here are quite severe. What I would say has been interesting about these cases, and I'll come back to MIT and just kind of talk about a couple others here. If you go to the next slide, Anne. These are just some other kind of high profile indictments of faculty, and you can see, or other types of sanctions. And you can see here they've, again, similar. So at Ohio State, they were focused on allegedly false and misleading statements to NIH. West Virginia, again, ties to China and the Thousand Talents program. You can see that running through here. What I think is in some cases not quite so apparent from some of these enforcement actions, and we'll have to see as we learn more about MIT, is that in most of these cases there is something beyond not just beyond simply not making a disclosure. There's some other action or behavior or conduct, whether that is lying to an investigator in the middle of them trying to look into activity outside the US, whether it is tax issues, whether there are particularly problematic documents behind the scene that suggest an intent to conceal. So I think the message here would be, yes, there is absolutely risk and exposure for individual faculty members. But one of the things that I think is important to keep track of is that it often, at least in my experience, is something more than just non-disclosure that really creates risk for individual faculty members. And, I think over the past 18 months, I think we've worked with, more than 36 universities, academic medical centers, quite a bit more than that. And, some of the fact patterns have frankly been very concerning, and those that have tended to move into criminal investigations, as I say, the vast majority have had some catch other than just non-disclosure. What you don't see on this slide is enforcement against institutions. And it doesn't mean that there hasn't been enforcement against institutions. There has been one False Claims Act settlement against an institution that was directly tied to researcher activity in China. That has not been the norm, but it, I think, is an important example of the fact that the risk in this space is not just individual risk, but there is institutional risk. And what that tells me is that it is quite important to structure your response to oversight by an agency or investigative activity by the Justice Department in a way that recognizes there is potential skin in the game for the institution. So we will come back and talk about some of the practical tips and steps to try to navigate through oversight activity. But I think for now, maybe we'll go to the next slide, Anne.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will address sort of that question of, well, how do you know what you don't know, and how do you talk to faculty to make sure it's important to have that open communication internally to vet what needs to be disclosed so that you can at least capture those unknowns to protect the institution.
So here, this is a slide that just kind of focuses a little bit on expectations here. And I'm not going to read the slide to you here, but I think that the takeaway here, if you look across NIH and NSF in particular, is all of the heightened reporting has been pitched by federal agencies as a clarification of kind of how they believe things should have been done going back in time. But I think when you look through this, a lot of this is I think fairly characterized as a fair bit of bar raising. So if you look at it collectively, what you can see here is that maybe 3 years ago, there was a lot of focus on making sure that research funding that flowed through the applicant institution was disclosed, and biosketches were not a particularly significant issue. And now, if you look at it, there's much more significance placed on appointments outside of the grantee or applicant institution, whether paid or unpaid. There's a much broader focus on non-financial resources, in-kind support, just a general harder look at collaboration with colleagues outside the United States, a particular focus on participation in talent programs. And one of the things that I think Anne will talk a little bit about as we get to the end is particularly at NIH, a growing interest in considering whether activities outside the US and global engagement can introduce potential financial conflicts of interest issues. And one of the things that I have seen in 2021 already, what are we, 2 weeks into 2021, that I didn't see at all in 2020 were specific communications from NIH following up on what I call the Lauer letters that went out to dozens and dozens of institutions and asked folks to look into potential foreign influence, specific follow-up, pushing the question of whether there were financial conflicts of interest. So DoD, you can see, is a little bit different. They historically didn't have the same level of robust, current pending, other support type requirements, but they too have started to focus on this issue beginning in the spring of 2019. It's still a very significant issue for them. And as I said, they tend to, depending on the nature of the research, perhaps have a bit more of a IP leakage focus than some of the civilian agencies. I don't know if you wanted to chime in on this one, Anne.
Yeah, well, I think that you've captured it, and we're going to talk about essentially where kind of moving in this direction, in the direction around conflicts of commitment and interest. But our first polling question is about sort of what we have seen for grants administration and the topic of other support and biosketches. And I would really like the group participating to answer this first polling question. We'll have a couple during this session. But whether or not, the question is, does your institution have the capacity to review biosketches for an impending support required at the time of proposal or just in time, and certainly before award acceptance, as well as progress report submissions to review the accuracy of PI disclosures? So take a second to think about that and hit yes or no if you think your institution has that capacity or has built in some capacity to spend more time on this. Certainly, Mike, I have seen more of our clients looking closely at this process and trying to weigh how much information should be reviewed centrally versus information that should be coming from the departments and the department's responsibility for gathering all this information from the faculty. But I've certainly seen that struggle from institutions in terms of how to build in the capacity. So let's see if we have some results. Oh, exactly 50-50, interesting. So looks like I would have expected more no's. I thought that that would be the more common response, but I do know, as we've been talking about the last 18 months, we know that this has drawn so much attention that many of your central pre-award offices have put a lot of dedicated time or staff on this, or have put more expectations on the department to spend more time on biosketches and progress reports. Okay, so moving forward, Mike, if you can talk a little bit more about some of the legislative activity you've seen, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I think here also we're going to kind of go through the next couple slides pretty quickly, so we can kind of talk you folks through investigations and then proactive compliance. So I think the message here is that, going back to 2020, there was the Safeguarding American Innovation Act. There were legislative activity and oversight, talking just focused on foreign gifts under Section 117. So I think the takeaway here is that this is a bipartisan issue. We're about to have a new administration tomorrow. I don't think that a change in administration is going to result in a material change in focus on global engagement risks and international collaboration risks in the research space. And that's kind of reflected in the NDAA for 2021, where there are a couple provisions in there again that focus on heightening and harmonizing disclosure requirements across the entire federal government. So I think the message from a legislative and policy trajectory, and Anne, if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about this, is that this is, I think, as I said, it's a bipartisan issue. It is an issue that continues to be front and center at major grant-making agencies, particularly at NIH and NSF. GAO came out with a report in December around the holidays that, again, was somewhat similar to the NDAA in terms of ramping up disclosure. There was a recommendation in the GAO report to think about changing financial conflict of interest rules for the purpose of kind of bringing them more into alignment with where NIH seems to be heading. So, we have that. We have the HHS OIG survey that came out in December, and responses continued to trickle in throughout the first part of January, again, which focused not only on other support, but also on financial conflicts of interest again. So, if we're trying to do a little bit of tea leaf reading, I think we're going to continue to see additional guidance coming out in this space. NIH has been pretty clear that they're contemplating additional guidance/rules that would include, among other things, an expectation that U.S. institutions are going to have contracts available for their faculty activities outside the U.S. We'll be able to make those available to NIH. So, we're going to continue to see that. From a Justice Department perspective, we may well see a reorienting of overall department policy with the new administration, but it doesn't mean that active cases are going to be dropped. We're still anticipating continued Justice Department interest in this space. And I think that, we'll also probably see continued risk in the False Claims Act space from whistleblowers and things like that as this continues to become a more front and center issue. So, Anne, do you want to chime in on some of this?
Yeah, I think some of the perspective I have has to do with this push, or this sort of moving the dial away from just thinking about progress reports and other support and central pre-award processes towards particularly more harmonized policies across agencies for FCOI and conflict of commitment disclosures. Now, conflict of commitment has not been something that's been regulatory, has a regulatory guidance or policy on, and that's it's typically an institutional procedure or policy if your institution has for capturing outside activities outside of an individual's institutional appointment. But we're now seeing these reports, GAO, the focus from NDAA Section 223, talking about harmonizing towards looking at outside appointments and conflict of interest. So I really do think it's been moving this direction. We've had many questions over the last year about, should we be changing our COI policies to capture foreign activities now, or should that be a grants administration role? And so we'll talk about what that means and how you might capture data to support this, because that's a big challenge. But I think in the spirit of our title, A Year of New Normals, I do think that is going to be an emerging area that would have to sort of stabilize and figure out how to manage that connection between commitments, interest, and granting the grant information that's disclosed. I also found it really interesting just a few days ago that the Biden administration has now made OSTP a formal cabinet position or part of the cabinet. You know, President-elect Biden will have a scientific advisor as part of the cabinet. So, and I think very much a focus will be on that balance of the value of international collaboration, but managing the risks we have with that global collaboration. So we're still awaiting more guidance from OSD, as Mike has said, and the agencies are federal agencies are sort of awaiting guidance on how do we implement this harmonization of policies. But whether or not things will stop or change, I don't think so either. I agree with Mike. It'll continue.
All right. So we're going to turn now to managing some of these foreign influence investigations, and I'll cover that a bit and then turn it over to Anne for some thinking on proactive compliance. So there are a variety of different investigations that come up in the foreign influence space. If we go back to 2018, 2019, there were the NIH letters that Dr. Lauer sent out that basically raised issues and tasked institutions with conducting internal investigations to look into potential foreign influence. There are internal investigations that arise through your own diligence or somebody coming forward with potential issues. There are criminal investigations, and then there can be civil investigations. So I thought what we would do, just because we're seeing a lot of criminal investigative activity in this space, is maybe start there and then cover some of the other types of investigations. And I think what you'll see is that there are kind of consistent themes across all of this investigative activity. And we've laid out some of them here in terms of, trying to, be as cooperative as you can. Obviously, you need to defend yourself. You need to defend yourself quite aggressively, but it doesn't mean you can't cooperate and have a reasonable relationship with government investigators. And all of these other steps here in terms of communications and investigation, we'll talk a little bit about those. So in the criminal space, there have been a lot of grand jury subpoenas that have issued that are directly tied to questions of foreign influence. These subpoenas tend to focus on individual faculty members. They are served on their US institution. And in the vast majority of these cases, the employing institution in the US is a witness in the matter, not a subject or target of the investigation. Nonetheless, you do have a grand jury subpoena. You do have to put in the work and effort to respond to the subpoena. You have to manage the Justice Department prosecutors. And some of the things that we see in this space, they create a number of challenges, both internally and externally. Grand jury subpoenas are typically accompanied by, at a minimum, a request to keep the subpoena confidential. Sometimes they can have more, sometimes they can have a court order requiring you to do that. But regardless, they tend to create challenging faculty issues because you have the dueling question of wanting to, make sure that you're doing what you can for your faculty, and having to balance that against requests from prosecutors to keep your faculty in the dark. Can raise some challenging questions in terms of dealing with the Justice Department and dealing with your faculty. Those same requests for confidentiality in the criminal context can constrain what you can do internally in terms of your own internal investigation. So, in the criminal context, I think that it is really important to, recognize that normally your institution is going to be a witness, and really your objective is to stay a witness and not become something worse. So it requires very careful and thought out communication with the Justice Department to make sure that you're not getting out ahead of them or do anything that they can view as interfering with their investigation. Typically, we've generally been able to navigate these in a way that allows the institution to make sure that it stays just a witness, try to, when appropriate, be supportive of faculty, and at the same time, make sure that there are good relationships with the Justice Department, because again, at the end of the day, my job, at least as a lawyer, is representing the institution, not any of its faculty. But some of the criminal investigations have been ones that create a lot of challenging and interesting issues for universities and AMCs that, thankfully for them, don't spend a lot of time in the criminal world. The other kind of issues that come up are dealing directly with sponsoring agencies. And again, I think the principles that we see are similar. You don't have the same types of constraints in terms of necessarily being limited in what you can do internally in terms of looking into facts and talking to whoever you want to talk to and conducting interviews with whoever you want to interview. But again, similar principles, right? We always try to make sure that we're working with sponsors. Those are all critically important relationships to an institution. We want to make sure that we're being responsive. We want to make sure that we're answering their questions and getting them what they need. That often requires a pretty thorough internal investigation. One of the things that I have seen is that, sometimes these investigations or responses to agencies may not necessarily be handled by folks who are, kind of expert investigators and askers of questions and things like that. And sometimes, again, these are this is oversight activity and it has to be respected as such. And what can happen is that, sometimes things can go sideways if there's not a recognition institutionally that you really do need to circle up not only with the research administration team, but with maybe the compliance function, maybe the general counsel's office. There needs to be a concerted and organized effort to make sure that you're doing what you need to do to protect the institution. As I said at the beginning of this discussion, most of the administrative oversight activity has not resulted in sanctions against institutions. Now, it doesn't mean there hasn't been money returned. It doesn't mean that sometimes grants may or may not be put at risk. But in terms of very serious False Claims Act-like enforcement activity against institutions, that has been generally pretty rare. But the process has to be managed to make sure that at the end of the day, the institution, which is the grantee, is doing what it needs to do to protect itself and make sure that that's done in a way that is going to limit exposure. And one of the ways to do that is to have a really good proactive compliance program in this space, because it is always better if you have issues that you bring them to the government rather than them come knock on your door. And that's why what we wanted to do with the end of our session today, before we take questions, is have Anne talk a little bit about some of the compliance and risk mitigation strategies that she's helped institutions with.
Great, thanks, Mike. I think that's a good segue. I think it's also part of the challenge when you're even in an investigation. How far do you dig? How far do you go to dig up information, but also ensure, certainly in an investigation, there's quite a bit of diligence to be done internally or even internal investigations to identify information. But what we have seen during this time, for those institutions maybe not be part of an investigation, or maybe they were and identified some vulnerabilities during that time, so are taking a more proactive look across compliance for foreign influence and foreign activities. So I want to share a little bit about how you make that transition to more proactive review, whether you've been through an inquiry from a federal agency or you're really just getting started with getting your arms around this across the university. But the one thing that we have seen, and I mentioned a few minutes ago in terms of what to expect in 2021, is that most of the focus has been on the right here on the impacted areas in the top right row around PIs and their biographical documents, such as other support and CVs, progress reports, and now we're moving the dial towards looking more closely at potential conflicts of interest and commitments as it relates to foreign activities. But a lot of the focus has been there, and so probably rightly so, as we've been following the guidance and clarity from agencies, been focused on the pre-award grant space and how do we build in procedures and controls to make sure we're doing our disclosures appropriately. That's involved a number of offices, but primarily, in my experience, it's been the pre-award at central office working with PIs and departments. The perspective that we have here at Huron and sort of how we've been helping universities and AMCs evaluate the risk is that the exposure to foreign influence or the types of risks we're talking about are not just focused there on that top right or just on the pre-award grants area, but that a comprehensive or an integrated program really should think about all of these touch points and operations outside of just research administration, but even other areas within research administration that maybe haven't been core focused yet. And along the line of sort of having 3 lines of defense for compliance, there's several lines of defense, if you will, or several lines of exposure to foreign influence on the left side, meaning the various stakeholders and leadership that's involved in these discussions. And truly having an oversight or monitoring program for foreign influence will involve all of these particular areas, or should involve many of these areas, and may involve creating new procedures or revamping procedures for more integration and more controls across these areas. So when I'm talking about other areas, certainly others within research administration that we see are critical to be thinking about when you're thinking about foreign risks, are areas around export controls or foreign gifts and partnerships, which we've seen foreign gifts be very much a focus of the Department of Education over the last year, but that also can impact research administration in terms of foreign gifts that may be given to an investigator. Also looking at challenges around systems access and data security, and how you engage in with other entities at your institution around restricted party screening, visiting scholars, other visa compliance issues that may come up, and then foreign travel, how that's managed and tracked. Essentially, there's other operational support areas and functions that can get involved here in this discussion about monitoring for risk. And it's a broad a challenge because it's such a broad topic. It's not just research. Certainly today's session has been about the focus of foreign influence and research. But as we're talking to clients and as we're seeing you all develop programs to look at this, it's very clear it's going to require a lot of collaboration with other units at your institution. And it's not just going to be managed within research admin essentially. It's going to take a lot of support from others. So another polling question for you along that topic. I went through a couple of different top areas of foreign influence potential risk. Which of the following would you say is your biggest challenge when you think about managing foreign influence at your institution? Is it research, or is it some of these others that you're getting concerned about or have concerns about? And Mike, while we wait for those, I don't know if you have any perspective on that viewpoint about these broader areas, sort of how it integrates into a compliance program, or perhaps what you're seeing or hearing from other clients.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of areas of an institution that are potentially helpful in terms of mitigating foreign influence risk. But I think one of the things that, from a legal perspective that I think about when working with clients on kind of proactive compliance is if we're going to say, for example, change a questionnaire for conflicts of interest, we need to make sure that there's a way that information makes its way over to the research administration team. I think one of the risks is continuing to think about these various parts of an institution in a siloed way. And if you're going to ramp up foreign influence compliance in one area, you just have to make sure that that enhanced information then makes its way into grant applications, progress reports, et cetera, and is used for managing risk. Or in a way, you've kind of made things worse because you now have more information that you haven't done anything with.
Exactly. All right, let's check out what the results show here. Yep, so looks like about 40% said COI and COC, and sort of where that, probably question marks about where that's going and what kind of policy changes may be expected. Research administration, and then followed by information security. In particular, I think on information security, and let me just pause there, export controls, the other one with about 10%. But with information security, I think it's really interesting to consider that universities and AMCs have done a lot around information security and really managing the threat of theft of data at your institutions for a number of years, particularly during this COVID time and remote work from home. That's been a key emphasis, a key risk area where a lot of attention has been at institutions on building controls and building the proper risk monitoring for information security. But what we don't see often enough is a real plan for data security specific to the needs of research and specific to the needs of research in with foreign entities and foreign collaborators. And so I see, as we said, that about 10% of those who might have some concern. So that's another area. In fact, I'm going to talk at the end of our session, but we have a webinar a week from today more around information security. So when we think about the risk areas, Mike, you mentioned, it's hard to sometimes capture the conflict of commitments or conflict of interest and get that to the grants department so that they can be reviewing it. Yep. There's other types of risk factors that can be looked at on a proactive basis to help gauge, kind of where you might have bigger risks or where there might be vulnerabilities for those researchers who might show up or have question marks, or that you might want to do more vetting of related to their disclosures and related to their conflicts. And so these are some areas to think about as either triggers or factors to consider when assessing your risk at your institution. And I'm not going to go into all of these, but I will say we have seen a number of institutions take positions that on conflict of commitments, for example, and COI, that they're going to add questions around foreign activities, capture that information in some way that's then shared with the central pre-award or perhaps shared with departments that can be vetted and then determine what should go in progress reports and other support, biosketches and so on, but utilizing and sharing that data and going through that exercise of adding that information. As Mike said, if you're gathering these risk factors and data behind each of these categories, it's really important you do something with it and it does not sit in a file and be information that you have found but not done any vetting with or talking with other units. I think the big challenge, though, I think you all face in your environments are the fact that all of the data for each of these risk factors is in disparate systems, and there's no one real central system to capture everything. So we're talking about grant systems, compliance modules, ERPs, procurement, all systems that might have information that would help you assess your risk around foreign activities, but there's no way it's all pulled together. And so, I know a lot of institutions are thinking about how do we build dashboards or tools to gather information and just give us an idea of, what are the top 10 areas we need to focus on, or the top 10 departments or researchers that we need to be taking a closer look at. And some of the due diligence that we've seen taken has been a little bit more concerted effort of sitting down and looking at specific risk areas. we don't always recommend that you do a deep dive and identify all problem areas, because again, you might have to make some disclosures based on that, but there's a balanced way to take a look at what your risk profile is and where you may need to shore up some controls. So these are some of the areas that we've spent time with clients looking at closely, or pulling some data to get a sense and to better understand if sampling will help just assess where there's potential risk areas. With all that said, as I said, it's a lot of data. It's a lot of operational units that may need to be involved to really get an integrated approach towards compliance for foreign risks. And when I think most places are thinking right now about what are those true research areas and operational areas that we need to put in new procedures, policies, or controls to really make sure we're disclosing, getting the information and disclosing what's required. But I think what's really going to be critical that I tried to depict here is it's not just those activities in the bottom right, the operations, but it really is around broader compliance oversight. And as I said, that we had a few seconds ago about a pyramid of all the stakeholders involved. We're seeing some institutions pull together committees around foreign influence, or making sure there's a designated leadership that's thinking about this collectively as one approach. So this is just one depiction of the really kind of the principles that should be considered when you think about a compliance program for foreign influence. At the top, when we think about oversight, we're talking about what's your institutional culture and governance, and what should it look like going forward, because you certainly want to emphasize, or most institutions still want to emphasize, international collaboration and the high value of that research that global collaboration brings, and how it's important to your culture. So setting some governance and setting some kind of ground rules and clarity and communication is important, including communication around diversity and inclusion, and how to balance that for those who may be feeling like they're targeted with this review of foreign influence. Certainly monitoring is thinking about what tools, what data, what systems do we need to capture all of this, and what controls we have going forward, and who's going to be responsible for any kind of program for monitoring. And then training and education, I think, is really critical. I've spent a lot of time with faculty going through sessions on foreign influence and trying to help articulate what they really need to help disclose in documentation, and essentially trying to communicate, when in doubt, disclose to your institution. Not everything disclosed in conversations or on the documentation has to be, and may not all be disclosed to agencies, but we first need to look at it, talk about it, figure out what does need to be disclosed, since we're going that direction with the federal agencies and they're giving more specific guidance. But in my experience with faculty, they want to know specifics. They want to know what's appropriate and not appropriate, what can't do. You know, when we're traveling again, can I travel to these countries to do my research? Do I have to stop? So thinking about how you're going to communicate that information and what your position is, and how you're going to be there to support them in those conversations. So our last polling question is who has led efforts at your institution related to foreign influence, risk monitoring, identification, or management? If there's sort of one group that has been responsible, who would you say it would be? And as I said a few seconds ago, many institutions have pulled together committees with representatives from all of these groups. But in many cases over the last year, I think Central Research Administration, in particular pre-award, has had to spend a lot of time really in the weeds around disclosures. And we may see a broader push towards institutional compliance, research compliance, and others being involved. All right. Take a look at the responses. So as we've likely expected, Central Research Administration, probably 50% of the time, has been on point or leading, and that's really even the direction NIH set from the beginning when questions were posed to NIH about who, is this Central Research Administration, is this COI management, and most of it has been pushed there. So initially, but it looks like a fair amount of you have your research integrity or research compliance office involved as well as general counsel who may very well be on point and heavily involved in investigation work as well. So in closing, I think it's helpful to kind of step back and think about, while this is certainly a challenge in this it's been a challenge last year, but going into this new year, the challenges of enhanced communications, hopefully from federal agencies, from as a result of some of the reports that have come out from GAO or NDAA legislation. What are, I think it's important that your institution to be talking to your leadership and those in leading the charge and compliance programs or looking at foreign influence, to really think about what are the principles at your institution and what are the values you want to hold true while protecting from these foreign influence risks. So I've laid these out here as some of those that, from Huron's point of view, that are important to consider. It's not just about the data and the monitoring and collaboration between units. It's a much bigger challenge there about, as I mentioned, diversity, inclusion, and promoting the value of international collaboration and making sure that that's still on the forefront related to your strategy and mission. So I kind of leave you with these guiding principles to think about as you're thinking through the program itself that can help manage the risk. Before we jump to questions, just want to preview that we do have another webinar next week that has a tie to foreign influence and that we'll be talking about data security compliance for research. We also have an ongoing foreign influence series at Huron with a number of thought pieces and articles that you can access through either LinkedIn or through Huron's website. And then our research compliance library is also available with complimentary thought leadership on our website. So please check that out. So let's turn, with a few minutes we have left, let's turn to some questions. Let's see. So as mentioned, NIH have used publications as a source to verify. However, it's unclear on how support listed in publications relates to where this information needs to be reported in documents. Can you clarify how and where the information should be included in grant documents? And so some other comments that there may be a level in the publication information that may not be true other support or foreign component. So from NIH perspective, they have asked that you include that information about publications when within proposal time, just in time, or before award acceptance. And NSF has been asking that you include the list of publications and co-authors very explicitly within their documentation. And this has been a big question from faculty. Wow, how do I list all of my collaborators? I do papers with 50 co-authors. They're not all substantive to this research. So there are questions about how you define the publications and collaborations that you disclose. And in the perspective and training we've given to faculty, really thinking about those collaborations and publications is when they either represent a foreign component, there's a foreign component on the research. The research may take place in a foreign location, or that collaborator has a substantive portion of the work such that it would need to be disclosed as other support.
And I think on this, I think the other thing I would just say about publications is NIH tends to use them as, as a roadmap to whether a faculty member may have an appointment outside the United States, and also as potential indicia of foreign components. But it doesn't necessarily mean that having co-authors from outside the United States creates a foreign component. It's, as I said, it's something that NIH has pointed to as a potential indicia, but not necessarily dispositive. And the point here about embellishment, I think that is a very valid point, that it's not uncommon for faculty to list NIH grant support for, all or close to all of their publications, because it's important to them to have the prestige of being a PI on an NIH R01. So that's something we see quite frequently in our investigations.
Yeah, and follow up to that, another question is an institution that's internally updated their NIH BioSketch and other support forms should we use those now or wait till agencies issue new forms? My guidance is use them now. That's great that you've updated them to be as comprehensive as possible. So I would not wait, and I would go ahead and use them now.
I don't think that there's really much of a choice there. I think that
Right.
you just can't continue pre-August 2018 approach to this. You have to evolve as guidance evolves.
Another question might be interesting to get your perspective is many institutions use 5,000 as the threshold for reporting significant financial interest. Do you recommend removing that threshold when asking about foreign interest?
Yeah, that's, you know, if you look at the NIH guidance on their, you know, what I call their grid on their protecting biomedical resources page, there's a lot of focus on, you know, frankly, things that are not income to a researcher and simply don't fit squarely within the current FCOI regulations, the PHS regulations. You know, I think institutions are taking different approaches on this. Some are continuing as best they can. You know, sometimes for in-kind support, you know, I don't even know how you'd go about valuing some of that. So I'm seeing institutions just take different approaches in terms of whether they're going to try to look at activity outside the U.S. through the lens of the PHS regs as written, or whether they're being more expansive. And I think right now, I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer on that.
Yeah, I would agree that there's not much clarity, but in what I have seen is that institutions are sort of defaulting to include any of that foreign interest to at least assess internally whether it's material or how they should be handling that disclosure. And some that I've worked with in developing those questions around foreign interest have not had the threshold because they'd like to be conservative at this time until more guidance.
I think that's probably the more common approach, and is to, if you're going to questionnaire to collect more information, not to have a dollar threshold. But what I would say is that, again, if you go down that road, you now have all of this information, and you have to act on it. You can't just collect it and not do anything, or you've made things worse.
Okay. I think that we've addressed most of the questions. If you have others, feel free to reach out to Mike or I directly. Our email addresses are here. We will be sharing the slides at a future date and some of the results of those poll questions you'll get. So we'll try to share those with you shortly, and then certainly reach out. And Mike, thank you for the conversation about this today. It'll be interesting to see what happens next, but we really appreciate your dialogue on this and your perspective.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Have a good day.